Finally, this week marks the fifth anniversary of the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act, better known as the stimulus. 5 years on, the economy remains sluggish, but supporters say that the stimulus saved the economy from going off a cliff. Casey Gibbon, could they both be right?
I would say that no, they could not. In short, I think the stimulus has been a giant failure. I mean, if we look just very much concretely on what it was supposed to accomplish, in 2009, the CBO released a report basically projecting that the stimulus would result in a 5% unemployment by 2013. In fact, it was supposed to be, I believe, by 2011 or 2012 as well, that it was supposed to be about 5%. Unfortunately, we see today that that unemployment currently is 6.6% as of January, and even throughout most of the year since the stimulus was passed, the unemployment was higher than the CBO projected it would be because of the stimulus. And that's because it's just been a failure. I think even by going into Keynesian economic standards of an economic stimulus, it really has not accomplished its goals. So, as Larry Summers famously said, a good stimulus should be targeted, timely, and temporary. Well, as far as timely and temporary, it's still, the stimulus goes on for over about, $831 billion over about a 10-year period. And it hasn't really been targeted either. It's really just kind of been thrown at every single government sector, from education to tax incentives to healthcare to unemployment insurance. So it really hasn't so much been a targeted stimulus as Keynes would recommend. It's just kind of spending more taxpayers' dollars to prop up some state and local governments that are having revenue problems. And I think that really this overall did more damage to the economy by racking up huge amounts of debt that will eventually have to be paid off in one form or another.
Dr. Veghte, your response?
Well, with all due respect, Casey, I disagree strongly with what he said. Any economist, 99% of economists would agree that when you have the kind of near depression that we had when Obama took office, that you have to do something, and Republicans would have done, if they had been in power, they would have done a similar stimulus. In fact, they were in negotiations about how to achieve this. Right. As Obama took office. So it's basic economics that you have to stimulate demand when demand is sagging, or else you have massive unemployment. And the stimulus did save, it was estimated by economists to have saved over 3 million jobs. And so that's a tremendous victory. If we hadn't done it, we would have 3 million fewer jobs. And the debt that it caused is minimal in comparison to our overall debt. That certainly is not a convincing argument. You have to, when you have the economy in a recession or near depression, you have to stimulate demand. And then when the economy is flourishing several years down the road, you have to pay that debt off. And that's how most economists agree that that's how you should proceed with public policy in this area. Unfortunately, since the stimulus, there's been tremendous austerity. For some reason, the House Republicans have been fixated on austerity instead of on the jobs crisis. We have a massive jobs crisis in this country, massive unemployment, and underemployment, and people have withdrawn from the labor force. That's the number one public policy issue, as a Pew study recently, their surveys have recently again affirmed that that's Americans' number one concern going into the midterms. What we need is more spending on infrastructure, education, things to not only jumpstart the economy today, but the kinds of investments that would promote economic growth down the road and enable us to compete with China, India, and other countries.
Well, I think if you go into the specifics very concretely of what the stimulus did, it really most of these are very temporary, are not very long term aids to the economy. So, for example, taking transportation as one example, there was about I believe $105 billion done to transportation. Those are largely part-time jobs that for construction. And while it does result in roads being built, etc., it's still adding on billions of dollars to a transportation fund that already the United States has for decades only been increasing. So I think that if you look at other things like education, so there was $100 billion spent on state and local governments. Education, again, these are really to a temporary boost for states to perhaps keep some workers in or whatnot, some teachers in. Oh, excuse me. But these are all temporary federal money that is not a sustainable revenue source, and I think it really could end up biting states in the future. And I think that overall the record can clearly be seen that the stimulus was a failure, again because of unemployment projections. And overall, it's certainly true that there is an economic consensus that in times of recession there needs to be stimulus to increase demand. But I think there's been plenty of times throughout American history where we've seen that instead of stimulating the economy, the government has instead taken a laissez-faire stance and letting the market self-correct itself, and we've seen quickly that it does so quickly. Again, and this is kind of a cliche example that a lot of people like to point to, but under Calvin Coolidge in 1928, I believe there was a recession that was almost as deep and bad as the initial Great Depression, but ultimately I believe it was 1919. But ultimately, the government took a laissez-faire stance, and the market self-corrected itself. So I think that these kind of stimulus efforts will only prolong the problems that we see in the economy.
Anything you would like to add, Dr. Veghte?
Well, I mean, obviously, the laissez-faire policies helped lead us into the Great Depression initially, so it's certainly not a model for the future. There's really no disagreement among economists about the need for stimulus. The first stimulus, a third of it was tax cuts, which most people don't realize. They were thrown in there to make it more of a bipartisan agreement, even though Republicans didn't end up voting for it. It consisted 1/3 out of tax cuts as an effort to compromise, and also to inject money more quickly into the economy. Another big chunk of it was keeping teachers employed on the state level, teachers and firefighters and police, and that is certainly was very worthwhile. The CBO has found that was one of the most effective bangs for the buck and paid off tremendously. That wasn't adding new employees to the state payrolls. That was keeping people who were already employed. It was bridging the recession so that those people stayed employed, and that has paid off. Certainly, the perfect should never be the enemy of the good. Was the stimulus perfect? No. I mean, we have a sausage-making Congress. Deals were put together where some districts got certain programs for their districts, others got programs for their districts. If you could design the stimulus bill, on a tabula rasa, you might design it differently. But we don't live in a parliamentary system where one party can come up with a platform and implement it and get it through Parliament. We live in a system with a district franchise where every congressperson goes to Congress to get something for their district, and that's our system. So, but that shouldn't be the enemy of a good bill. In the future, we need to continue to stimulate the economy until we come out of the recession in ways that promote employment. I think Casey would agree that we have underemployment right now. So infrastructure spending, education spending, to the extent that it's targeted and effective, I think he would agree that that's important.
How long do you think that a government should keep the stimulus going in order to see the plan come to fruition?
Probably until we get back to what our normal job trajectory would have been if we hadn't had the Great Recession. So the percent of the employment in the economy, labor market participation and employment, actually.
Casey, anything else you'd like to add?
Yeah, I think that really the stimulus is an interesting topic because it really reveals an underlying, a person's underlying look of economics. And I think that even if I were to grant Keynesian stimulus theory, completely grant that it's correct, the United States government is not practicing it correctly at all, because Keynes said very famously that yes, while during economic downturns there should be government stimulus to aggregate demand, but also he said that during surpluses there should be austerity measures, there should be cutting back. And unfortunately, I think that you see with the public choice, the incentives that the government have is that they want to spend during good times and spend during bad times. So I think that these kind of stimulus measures overall in the long term will only result in huge massive debts that we see. I mean, we already see in the United States today a national debt of about $17 trillion, and that's not even mentioning unfunded public pension liabilities on the federal level, on the state level, which which nearly double the debt. And I think that overall, these kind of measures are deeply dangerous in that eventually the American taxpayer will have to pay for it, and it could result in an even deeper and darker economic fiscal crisis. So I think that these things, it's easy to put on the blinders and look at the short terms, but in the long term trajectory, this could really have major damage to the United States economy.